At 38,000 feet above Colorado, Pacific Airways, Flight 447 was experiencing what pilots call a perfect flight day. Clear skies stretched endlessly ahead. Passengers were settled into their seats, and the Boeing 737's engines hummed with mechanical precision. In row 2, seat 2A, Rachel Martinez gazed out the window at the Rocky Mountains below, finally allowing herself to relax after 3 grueling weeks of final certification exams. She had no idea that in exactly 47 minutes, she would be the only thing standing between 156 people and disaster. This is the story of how a 26-year-old co-pilot became an overnight hero when everything that could go wrong did. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. March 15th dawned crisp and clear at Denver International Airport. The morning rush was in full swing as thousands of passengers moved through the terminals, most absorbed in their phones or coffee, treating air travel as the mundane routine it had become. Gate B7 buzzed with typical pre-boarding activity as Pacific Airways, Flight 447 prepared for its 9:15 a.m. departure to Seattle. Rachel Martinez arrived at the gate 40 minutes early, clutching her employee badge and boarding pass. The laminated ID still felt foreign in her hands. Pacific Airways, First Officer, Martinez. Rachel A. She'd only received it 3 weeks ago after completing her commercial pilot certification, and the title still sent a thrill through her every time she saw it. Growing up in Phoenix, Rachel had spent countless afternoons at Sky Harbor Airport, pressing her face against the terminal windows to watch planes take off. Her father, a mechanic for Southwest Airlines, would bring her to work occasionally, letting her sit in empty cockpits and explaining how every button and switch contributed to keeping hundreds of people safe in the sky. By age 8, she knew she wanted to be a pilot. By 16, she was taking flying lessons with money earned from weekend jobs. By 22, she had her private pilot license and was working toward her commercial certification while juggling 2 part-time jobs to pay for flight school. The path hadn't been easy. Flight training cost nearly $80,000, and Rachel had taken out loans that would follow her for years. She studied while working nights at a local diner, memorizing aircraft systems between serving coffee and clearing tables. Her instructors were tough, demanding perfection in everything from radio communications to emergency procedures. The written exams were brutal, covering everything from meteorology to federal aviation regulations. The practical tests were even worse. Instructors would simulate every possible emergency scenario, waiting for students to crack under pressure. But Rachel never cracked. She approached flying with the same methodical precision her father had taught her about aircraft maintenance. Every detail mattered. Every procedure had a purpose, and there was no such thing as good enough when lives were at stake. Her flight instructors noted her unusual composure during emergency simulations, though none of them could have predicted how crucial that trait would become. Now, 3 weeks into her career as a commercial pilot, Rachel was deadheading back to Seattle after completing recertification training in Denver. Deadheading was a common practice, pilots catching rides on flights to position themselves for their next assignment. It meant flying as a passenger instead of crew, a chance to observe other pilots' techniques and enjoy the rare luxury of looking out the window during flight. She settled into her aisle seat in row 2, nodding politely to the businessman beside her who was already deep in spreadsheets on his laptop. Behind her, a family with 2 young children was settling in for what the parents clearly hoped would be a quiet flight. The cabin filled quickly as business travelers, tourists, and locals heading home took their seats. From her position near the front of the cabin, Rachel had a partial view into the cockpit. She watched Captain David Richardson complete his pre-flight checks with the methodical movements of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times. Richardson was a legend at Pacific Airways, 22 years of commercial flying, over 15,000 flight hours, and a spotless safety record. Pilots called him Steady Dave because nothing seemed to rattle him. He'd landed planes in thunderstorms, dealt with mechanical failures, and once talked a trainee through a successful emergency landing when the younger pilot froze. During a practice scenario, next to Richardson sat First Officer Jennifer Walsh, who looked to be about Rachel's age. Walsh had joined Pacific Airways 8 months earlier and was still in what pilots called the steep learning curve phase of her career. Rachel recognized the intense concentration on Walsh's face as she worked. Through her checklist, the same expression Rachel wore during her own early flights when every procedure still required conscious thought rather than muscle memory. Pre-flight routine continued smoothly. Richardson's voice came over the intercom with the standard welcome message, explaining their route, flight time, and weather conditions. His tone was confident and reassuring, the voice of someone who had delivered the same information thousands of times and genuinely believed this would be just another routine. Flight attendant supervisor Maria Santos moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking that overhead bins were secured and seatbelts fastened. Santos had been with Pacific Airways for 12 years and had developed an instinct for spotting potential problems before they escalated. Today, nothing seemed out of place. The passengers were typical for a Tuesday morning flight, mostly business travelers, and a few vacationers heading to Seattle. No one appeared intoxicated, agitated, or unwell. The aircraft's system showed green across the board. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Flight 447 pushed back from the gate. Richardson's voice crackled through the cabin speakers as they taxied toward the runway. Flight attendants, prepare for departure. The Boeing 737's twin engines spooled up to takeoff power, and the aircraft accelerated down runway 34R with the mechanical precision that still amazed Rachel despite hundreds of flights as a passenger and trainee. The takeoff was textbook perfect. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing steadily through Denver's thin mountain air. Within minutes, they were above the cloud layer, surrounded by brilliant blue sky and endless mountain peaks stretching toward the horizon. Richardson leveled off at their assigned cruise altitude of 38,000 feet, and the familiar hum of the engines settled into the steady drone that would carry them to Seattle. For the first hour of flight, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The weather was cooperating beautifully, minimal turbulence, clear visibility, and favorable winds that would actually bring them into Seattle a few minutes ahead of schedule. Richardson and Walsh settled into the routine of long-distance flying, monitoring instruments, updating their position with air traffic control, and maintaining radio contact with Pacific Airways Operations Center. Rachel found herself dozing slightly, lulled by the engine's steady rhythm and the warmth of sunlight streaming through her window. This was supposed to be a rest day before she began her first official assignment as a Pacific Airways first officer. Tomorrow she would report to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport to begin flying the same route as Flight 447. Working with experienced captains who would help her transition from classroom theory to real-world aviation. She thought about calling her parents when she landed, sharing details about her training, and maybe finally admitting how nervous she was about her first official flights. Despite all her preparation, Rachel knew there was a difference between simulation and reality that no amount of training could fully bridge. Every pilot learned to fly in controlled environments where instructors carefully managed risk and emergency scenarios had predetermined solutions. Real flying meant dealing with weather that didn't match forecasts, mechanical problems that didn't follow textbook patterns, and split-second decisions that could affect hundreds of lives. But those concerns seemed distant at 38,000 feet on a perfect March morning. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly below, their snow-covered peaks glittering in the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Air traffic control had cleared them for a direct route to Seattle, meaning they would avoid the usual waypoints and navigate straight toward their destination. Richardson had mentioned over the intercom that passengers on the left side of the aircraft might catch glimpses of Mount Rainier as they approached Seattle, always a highlight for visitors to the Pacific Northwest. Rachel checked her watch. 10:02 a.m. They had been airborne for 47 minutes, and everything remained absolutely routine. In the cockpit, Richardson was reviewing their arrival procedure while Walsh monitored the aircraft systems. Behind Rachel, the businessman was still absorbed in his spreadsheets. The family's children had fallen asleep, and most passengers were reading, working on laptops, or gazing out windows. None of them knew that in less than 60 seconds, Flight 447 would transform from a routine morning commute into a test of everything Rachel Martinez had learned about flying, leadership, and keeping calm when the impossible happened at 38,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. The first sign something was wrong came at 10:03 a.m., exactly 48 minutes into what should have been Pacific Airways' most routine flight of the day. Rachel Martinez was reviewing approach charts on her tablet when she heard an unusual sound from the cockpit, not mechanical, but human. A sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers scattering. Captain David Richardson had been reaching for his coffee cup when the chest pain struck like lightning. The sensation began as a dull ache between his shoulder blades, the kind pilots often attributed to long hours hunched over controls. But within seconds, it exploded into crushing agony that radiated down his left arm and squeezed his chest like a vice. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, sending hot liquid across the instrument panel. "Dave?" First Officer Jennifer Walsh looked over as Richardson doubled forward in his seat, his face draining of color. She had never seen her captain show anything but complete composure, even during their most challenging flights. Now he was gasping, clutching his chest with both hands, unable to speak. Richardson tried to key his microphone to declare an emergency, but his hand wouldn't respond properly. The pain was overwhelming, accompanied by a crushing sensation that made each breath feel impossible. His vision began to tunnel as his body went into full cardiac arrest. Within 30 seconds of the first chest pain, Captain David Richardson was unconscious, slumped forward against his harness with his hands falling limply to his sides. Walsh's training kicked in, but not the way it was supposed to. She had practiced medical emergencies in simulators dozens of times, but those scenarios always involved passengers, not the captain beside her. Her hands shook as she reached for the intercom button, her voice cracking as she made the announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Passengers looked up from their books and laptops, exchanging uncertain glances. Medical emergencies weren't uncommon on commercial flights, but something in Walsh's tone suggested this was different. More serious. Dr. Robert Chun, a cardiologist returning to Seattle after a medical conference, was already unbuckling his seatbelt before the announcement finished. He had been a passenger during medical emergencies before and knew that every second mattered in cardiac situations. Flight attendant Maria Santos met him at the cockpit door, her professional composure barely masking the fear in her eyes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's the captain," Santos whispered as she led Dr. Chun into the cockpit. "He just collapsed." Dr. Chun took one look at Richardson and immediately began checking for vital signs. No pulse, no breathing. The captain's skin was taking on the grayish pallor that indicated his heart had stopped completely. Chun began CPR immediately, pushing Santos aside to get better access to Richardson's chest. "I need him flat," Dr. Chun said tersely. "Can we move him?" But moving an unconscious pilot from the captain's seat of a Boeing 737 at 38,000 feet wasn't like moving a patient in a hospital. Richardson was strapped into his seat with a complex 5-point harness system, surrounded by flight controls that couldn't be disturbed. Dr. Chun had to work around the constraints, performing chest compressions at an awkward angle while Walsh tried to maintain control of the aircraft. The situation in the cockpit was deteriorating rapidly. Walsh had maybe 200 hours of experience flying 737s, most of it under close supervision from veteran captains. She had never been alone at the controls of a commercial airliner, especially not with 156 passengers depending on her decisions. Her hands were visibly trembling as she tried to follow emergency procedures, while Dr. Chun worked frantically on Richardson just inches away. Seattle Center, Pacific 447. Walsh's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "We have a medical emergency. Captain is down. Requesting priority handling and medical assistance on arrival." The air traffic controller in Seattle's approach control facility had handled thousands of flights, but something in Walsh's tone immediately put him on high alert. Medical emergencies were routine, but when a pilot declared the captain was down, it meant the flight's command structure had just collapsed. Pacific 447, copy medical emergency. Say the nature of assistance required and pilot qualifications of the person in command. Walsh realized she was about to reveal something that would terrify every air traffic controller within radio range. "Seattle Center, I'm First Officer Walsh. I have approximately 8 months' experience on type. This is my first emergency as pilot in command." The silence on the radio frequency lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal. Every pilot listening to the frequency understood what had just happened. A rookie first officer with minimal experience was now solely responsible for landing a 737 loaded with passengers, and her captain was fighting for his life just feet away. Rachel Martinez heard every word of the radio exchange. Her pilot training had taught her to monitor cockpit communications during flight, partly out of professional interest and partly to stay current on air traffic control procedures. Now that training was screaming warnings in her head. Walsh's voice carried the unmistakable edge of someone approaching the limits of their ability to cope. Rachel unbuckled her seatbelt and moved toward the front of the cabin, her mind already running through emergency procedures she had memorized but never used in real situations. She could hear Dr. Chun's voice from the cockpit, urgent but controlled, calling out compression counts as he worked on Richardson. "Excuse me," Rachel said quietly to Santos, who was standing guard at the cockpit door. "I'm a commercial pilot. Is there anything I can do to help?" Santos looked at this young woman in civilian clothes with obvious skepticism. Rachel looked more like a college student than a pilot, especially standing next to the veteran flight attendant who had seen her share of passengers offering assistance they weren't qualified to provide. "Are you currently on 737 systems?" Santos asked. "I just completed certification 3 weeks ago," Rachel replied. "I'm deadheading back to Seattle to start flying this route. I have my credentials if you need to see them." Santos made a decision that would later be analyzed by accident investigators, aviation psychologists, and emergency response experts. Instead of following standard protocol and politely declining civilian assistance, she stepped aside and let Rachel Martinez enter the cockpit of Flight 447. Scene inside was controlled chaos. Dr. Chun was performing CPR with mechanical precision, counting compressions aloud while monitoring Richardson's condition. Walsh was dividing her attention between flying the aircraft and watching the medical emergency unfolding beside her, clearly struggling to process everything happening at once. Rachel took in the situation with the systematic approach her instructors had drilled into her during emergency training. Primary concern: aircraft control. The autopilot was engaged and the plane was maintaining altitude and heading, but Walsh looked dangerously close to panic. Secondary concern: emergency declaration and approach planning. Third concern: passenger management and preparation for possible emergency landing. First Officer Walsh, Rachel said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Rachel Martinez, certified on 737 systems. How can I assist?" Walsh looked up with a mixture of relief and desperation. Here was another pilot, someone who understood the complexity of what she was facing. It didn't matter that Rachel looked young or that her commercial experience was measured in weeks rather than years. What mattered was that she was qualified to help. "I've never handled an emergency this serious," Walsh admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this alone." Rachel slid into the observer seat behind the two pilot positions, immediately scanning the instrument panel to assess the aircraft's status. Everything looked normal, engines operating properly, all systems showing green, fuel sufficient for the planned route plus reserves. The emergency was medical, not mechanical, which meant they had time to plan rather than react to immediate threats. "Talk me through what happened," Rachel said, pulling out her phone to access her electronic flight manuals. Even though she had just completed certification, having reference materials available was standard practice for any emergency situation. Walsh explained. Richardson's sudden collapse while Dr. Chun continued working. The cardiologist looked up briefly to give his assessment. "Massive cardiac arrest. I've got him on manual compressions, but I need to get him to a hospital immediately." "How long to Seattle?" Rachel did quick mental calculations based on their current position and airspeed. "About 70 minutes at current speed and routing. We could request direct routing and higher priority, maybe cut that to 55 minutes. Dr. Chun shook his head grimly. "In cases this severe, brain damage begins after 4 to 6 minutes without circulation. I can maintain compressions, but his chances decrease significantly with every passing minute." The weight of that information settled over the cockpit. Richardson's life was literally in their hands, and every decision they made about routing, speed, and approach procedures would affect his chances of survival. But they also had to consider 156 passengers who were depending on them to get the aircraft safely on the ground. Rachel's training had covered scenarios like this in theory, but the simulators had never captured the emotional weight of having someone's life hanging in the balance while maintaining responsibility for an entire aircraft full of people. She forced herself to compartmentalize, focusing on the technical aspects of the situation rather than the human drama playing out just feet away. Seattle Center, Pacific 447. Rachel keyed the radio microphone, her voice steady and professional. "We need to amend our emergency. We have a captain down with cardiac arrest, doctor on board performing CPR. We're requesting immediate direct routing to Seattle and priority approach clearance. Pacific 447, Seattle Center. Understand captain down with cardiac arrest. Are you declaring emergency authority?" This was the moment that would define everything that followed. By declaring emergency authority, Rachel would be taking command of Flight 447 and accepting responsibility for every decision that followed. She would be the pilot in command, despite having never actually commanded a commercial flight outside of training scenarios. Seattle Center. This is Rachel Martinez, Pacific Airways pilot. I am assuming command of Flight 447 and declaring emergency authority due to captain incapacitation. The radio frequency fell silent for several seconds as controllers processed this information. Then came the response that confirmed Rachel's new role. "Roger, Captain Martinez." Pacific 447 cleared direct Seattle, descended and maintained flight level 240. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Captain Martinez. The title felt surreal. 3 weeks ago, she had been a flight student, struggling with complex approach procedures and memorizing emergency checklists. Now she was the pilot in command of a Boeing 737 with 156 passengers and a critically ill captain, whose life depended on getting to medical care as quickly as possible. Walsh looked at Rachel with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "Thank you," she said simply. I wasn't sure I could handle this alone. You don't have to, Rachel replied, already beginning to plan their approach to Seattle. We're going to work together. You know this aircraft better than I do, and I've got fresh eyes on the emergency procedures. Between the two of us, we'll get everyone home safely. Dr. Chun looked up from his compressions long enough to add, for what it's worth, you both sound like you know what you're doing. That's exactly what this situation needs, competence and confidence. But as Rachel began coordinating with air traffic control for their emergency approach, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Landing a 737 wasn't just about following procedures. It required judgment, experience, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. All things that typically came from years of experience she simply didn't have. Outside the cockpit windows, the Rocky Mountains still stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But now they represented more than just scenic beauty. They were obstacles to overcome, weather patterns to navigate, and terrain that could complicate an emergency approach if anything else went wrong with. Flight 447. Seattle Approach Control had seen emergencies before, but nothing quite like Pacific Airways Flight 447. Controller James Blackwood, a 15-year veteran of one of the nation's busiest approach facilities, was staring at his radar screen with growing concern. The aircraft's transponder showed it descending from 38,000 feet, but the voice on the radio belonged to a pilot he'd never heard before, someone claiming to be taking command of a commercial airliner mid-flight. Pacific 447, Seattle Approach. Say pilot qualifications and experience level for the record. Rachel Martinez looked at the radio with a mixture of dread and determination. She knew this question would come, and she knew her answer would likely cause alarm bells to ring in control towers across the Pacific Northwest. But there was no choice except absolute honesty. Seattle Approach, Captain Martinez. I have 340 total flight hours, certified on 737 systems as of 3 weeks ago. This is my first emergency as pilot in command. The silence that followed lasted only 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Rachel could practically hear the collective intake of breath from controllers who understood exactly what those numbers meant. 340 hours was barely enough to qualify for airline employment, let alone handle a medical emergency at altitude with over 150 lives at stake. Blackwood's training kicked in despite his personal concerns. Whatever his reservations about the pilot's experience level, his job was to provide the best possible assistance to get the aircraft safely on the ground. Pacific 447, understand you're a low-time pilot. Be advised we're coordinating with Pacific Airways operations and will provide maximum assistance. Current weather: Seattle is clear skies, winds 280 at 12 knots. Say your intentions. Rachel had been thinking about this moment since assuming command. The textbook answer would be to request the longest runway, fullest emergency response, and most conservative approach possible. But with Dr. Chun working desperately to keep Captain Richardson alive, every minute of delay could mean the difference between recovery and permanent brain damage or death. Seattle Approach. We need the fastest possible routing to SeaTac. Captain Richardson is in cardiac arrest with CPR in progress. Doctor aboard says time is critical. Roger. Pacific 447. Cleared direct Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Expect runway 16 left, distance 142 nautical miles. Emergency equipment is being positioned. Rachel looked at the navigation display and did quick mental calculations. At their current speed and altitude, they were still almost 40 minutes from landing, far longer than the critical window Dr. Chun had described. She needed to find ways to cut that time without compromising safety. First Officer Walsh, Rachel said, turning to her colleague who was monitoring engine parameters while trying to stay out of Dr. Chin's way. What's our maximum safe descent rate in current conditions? Walsh consulted her charts quickly. We can do 3,000 feet per minute comfortably, maybe 3,500. If we need to push it. Rachel had learned in flight school that steep descents could be dangerous for multiple reasons. They could stress the aircraft structure, make passengers uncomfortable, and complicate approach planning. But they also knew that in emergency situations, pilots had authority to exceed normal operating parameters if safety required it. Seattle approach. Pacific 447 requesting emergency descent clearance. We need to get down fast. Pacific 447, cleared to descend at pilot's discretion. Maintain 10,000 feet initially. Advise when ready for approach clearance. Rachel pushed the nose down more aggressively than she had ever done in training. The Boeing 737 responded immediately, the descent rate indicator climbing past 3,000 feet per minute. She could feel her ears popping as the cabin pressure system worked to compensate for their rapid altitude change. Behind her, Dr. Chun continued performing CPR with mechanical precision, but sweat was beading on his forehead from the physical exertion. Chest compressions were exhausting under normal circumstances, and maintaining them in the cramped confines of an aircraft cockpit while fighting turbulence and pressure changes made the task nearly impossible. How is he? Rachel asked during a brief pause in radio communications. Dr. Chun shook his head grimly. No pulse, no spontaneous breathing. I'm maintaining circulation artificially, but his brain is being deprived of oxygen with every passing minute. We need to get him to a hospital with cardiac intervention capabilities immediately. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Rachel like a physical force. She had trained for equipment failures, weather emergencies, and navigation problems. But nobody had prepared her for the psychological pressure of knowing that someone's life hung in the balance of every decision she made about speed, altitude, and approach procedures. Flight attendant Maria Santos appeared at the cockpit door, her professional composure intact, but strain showing around her eyes. Captain Martinez, the passengers are getting restless. They can tell something serious is happening. How much should I tell them? Rachel realized she had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she had almost forgotten about the 156 passengers who were probably sensing the tension despite being kept in the dark about specifics. Commercial aviation was built on routine and predictability, and anything that deviated from normal procedures made experienced travelers nervous. Tell them we have a medical emergency that requires priority landing in Seattle, Rachel decided. Emphasize that the aircraft is operating normally and we expect to land safely. Don't mention it's the captain unless someone asks directly. Santos nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. Rachel could hear her voice over the passenger address system, calm and professional, explaining the situation in terms designed to inform without causing panic. The radio crackled with a new voice. Pacific 447, Seattle approach. Be advised that Pacific Airways chief pilot wants to speak with you on company frequency 131.15. Rachel's stomach tightened. She knew that Pacific Airways chief pilot, Captain Thomas Bradley, had over 25,000 flight hours and had been flying commercially since before Rachel was born. He was probably calling to assess her competency and potentially provide guidance, or to question whether she should remain in command of the aircraft. Walsh, can you handle approach frequency while I talk to Bradley? Absolutely, Walsh replied, taking over radio duties with noticeably more confidence than she had shown earlier. Having another pilot in the cockpit seemed to have steadied her nerves considerably. Rachel switched to the company frequency with considerable trepidation. Pacific Operations, Pacific 447. Captain Martinez, this is Chief Pilot Bradley. I understand you've assumed command due to Captain Richardson's medical emergency. What's your current status? Rachel summarized their situation as concisely as possible. Richardson's cardiac arrest, Dr. Chun's ongoing CPR efforts, their emergency descent toward Seattle, and their estimated time to landing. She tried to keep emotion out of her voice and focus on facts. the way her instructors had taught her to communicate during crisis situations. Bradley's response surprised her. "Captain Martinez, I've reviewed your training records and certification scores. You graduated at the top of your class, and your instructors noted exceptional performance during emergency scenarios. I have full confidence in your ability to handle this situation." The words hit Rachel like a wave of relief. She had expected skepticism, maybe even an attempt to talk her through every procedure step by step. Instead, she was getting the kind of support that veteran pilots typically reserved for colleagues they had worked with for years. "Thank you, sir. That means everything right now. Here's what I can tell you that might help," Bradley continued. "Harborview Medical Center has one of the best cardiac units on the West Coast, and they're being notified about your situation. SeaTac Emergency Response has their best cardiac life support team standing by. Your job is to get that airplane on the ground as quickly and safely as possible." Rachel switched back to approach frequency as they passed through 15,000 feet, still descending rapidly. Seattle's skyline was becoming visible in the distance, the Space Needle and downtown skyscrapers rising above Elliott Bay. Under normal circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Today, it represented Salvation Medical Facilities that could save Richardson's life and the end of the most intense 40 minutes of Rachel's career. Seattle approach. Pacific 447 level at 10,000 feet. Ready for approach clearance. Pacific 447. Fly heading 090. Descend and maintain 6,000 feet. You're number 1 for runway 16 left. Contact tower on 119.9. Rachel felt a surge of adrenaline as they began their final approach phase. This was the moment where theoretical knowledge had to translate into practical skill. She had practiced dozens of approaches during training, but never with this level of pressure or with a medical emergency happening just inches away. Seattle. Tower's voice came through clearly as they switched frequencies. Pacific 447, Seattle Tower. Emergency equipment is in position. You're cleared for ILS approach runway 16 left. Current winds 280 at 15 knots. Visibility 10 miles. The instrument landing system approach to runway 16 left was 1. Rachel had practiced extensively during training. The electronic guidance system would help her maintain proper altitude and alignment with the runway, but the actual landing would require precise control inputs and judgment that only came from experience. "Walsh, I want you to handle the approach checklist while I fly," Rachel said. "Call out any deviations from normal parameters." "Roger that," Walsh replied, pulling out her approach checklist. Having specific tasks to focus on seemed to help her maintain composure despite the ongoing medical emergency just feet away. Dr. Chun looked up from his CPR efforts long enough to provide an update that sent chills through everyone in the cockpit. "I'm losing him. His color is getting worse, and I'm not getting any response. We need to be on the ground in the next 10 minutes or we're going to lose any chance of revival." 10 minutes. Rachel looked at their position on the navigation display and realized they were still 15 minutes from touchdown under normal approach procedures. She needed to find a way to compress the timeline without compromising safety, a decision that would require her to push both the aircraft and her own abilities to their limits. Seattle Tower. Pacific 447. We need to expedite this approach. Can you give us a direct to final approach course? Pacific 447. Understand, need to expedite. You're cleared direct to the ILS 16 left final approach course. Maintain 4,000 feet until established on the localizer. Rachel banked the aircraft more steeply than normal procedures called for, cutting directly toward the runway approach path. She could feel the 737 responding to her control inputs, but she was operating at the edge of her experience level. Every decision from this point forward would determine not just Richardson's survival, but the safety of everyone aboard Flight 447. The approach was about to become the most challenging Few minutes of Rachel Martinez's brief career, and she knew that everything she had learned about flying was about to be put to the ultimate test. At 4,000 feet above Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Rachel Martinez faced the most critical decision of her flying career. The instrument landing system guidance needles on her display showed they were perfectly aligned with runway 16 left, but they were coming in fast and steep, well outside the normal parameters she had practiced during training. Dr. Chun's 10-minute deadline was ticking away, and every second of delay could mean the difference between Captain Richardson's survival and death. Pacific 447, Seattle Tower, your approach speed appears high. Are you able to configure for landing? Rachel's hands moved across the control panel with practiced precision, lowering the landing gear and extending the flaps to their approach setting. The Boeing 737 shuddered slightly as the additional drag took effect, but their airspeed was still 20 knots faster than normal approach speed. In training, instructors would have called for a go-around and second attempt. Today, that luxury didn't exist. Seattle Tower, Pacific 447, configuring now. We're running out of time for the medical emergency. First Officer Walsh monitored the engine parameters as Rachel managed the approach, calling out altitudes and speeds with mechanical precision. 2,000 feet, 180 knots. Flaps 30, gear down and locked. Still fast but within structural limits. The runway was clearly visible now. A long strip of concrete surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Rachel could see fire trucks, ambulances, and medical response units positioned along the taxiways, a sobering reminder of how serious the aviation community was taking their emergency. Behind them, Dr. Chun's voice was becoming increasingly urgent. His lips are turning blue. I'm not getting adequate circulation despite compressions. We have maybe 5 minutes before the brain damage becomes irreversible. 5 minutes. Rachel looked at the approach path ahead and realized they were still 3 miles from touchdown. At their current speed, that meant roughly 2 minutes of flight time remaining, but landing was only the beginning. They would still need to taxi to the gate, get medical personnel aboard, and transfer Richardson to advanced cardiac care processes that normally took 10 to 15 minutes. Walsh, after we land, I want you to coordinate with ground control for the fastest possible taxi to a gate with medical access. Skip all the normal post-landing procedures except what's required for safety. Already on it, Walsh replied, demonstrating the kind of quick thinking that made good pilots great under pressure. I've been monitoring ground frequency. They're clearing all traffic and positioning medical personnel at Gate A7. The approach continued with textbook precision, despite the unconventional speed and descent rate. Rachel's hands felt steady on the controls for the first time since the emergency began. This was what she had trained for, not the medical crisis or command decisions, but the pure technical skill of flying an aircraft under challenging conditions. 1,000 feet, 170 knots, Walsh called out. Localizer and glide slope centered. Rachel began bleeding off airspeed as they descended through 800 feet, but she was still coming in hot. Landing fast wasn't necessarily dangerous if done properly, but it would require precise control inputs and careful brake application to avoid overrunning the runway. SeaTac's runway 16 left was 11,900 feet long, plenty of room for error under normal circumstances. But Rachel's margin for mistakes was shrinking with every foot of altitude. 500 feet, 160 knots. Still fast but manageable, Walsh reported. The runway threshold rushed up to meet them faster than Rachel had ever experienced. In training, approaches were always conducted at precisely the correct speed and descent rate, with instructors coaching students through every adjustment. Now she was flying by instinct and muscle memory, making split-second corrections based on visual cues and aircraft response. 50 feet, airspeed good. Looking stable, Rachel pulled the power to idle and raised the nose slightly. bleeding off the last of their excess speed as the main landing gear touched the runway with a firm but controlled impact. The 737's weight settled onto the concrete with a satisfying thump that meant they were safely on the ground. Seattle Tower, Pacific 447 is down and safe. Request immediate taxi clearance to the medical gate. Pacific 447, outstanding job. Taxi via Alpha, Charlie. Direct to Gate A7. Medical personnel are standing by. Rachel applied reverse thrust and wheel. Brakes more aggressively than normal, bringing the aircraft to taxi speed quickly. Through the cockpit windows, she could see emergency vehicles pacing them along the taxiways, ready to respond if anything went wrong during the final phase of their emergency. Dr. Chun looked up from his CPR efforts, sweat streaming down his face. "How long is the gate?" 2 minutes, Rachel replied, turning onto the final taxiway. "The medical team is waiting for us. I don't know if we have 2 minutes." His condition is deteriorating rapidly. Rachel keyed the radio to ground control. Seattle ground, Pacific 447. We need emergency medical personnel to meet us at the aircraft. The patient is in full cardiac arrest. Pacific 447. Medical team is positioned at Gate A7. Paramedics will board as soon as you're parked and engines shut down. The gate appeared ahead, with what looked like half of Seattle's emergency medical system waiting around it. Paramedics with advanced cardiac life support equipment, firefighters with rescue tools, and supervisors coordinating the response. Rachel had never seen such an extensive emergency response for a single patient. She brought the 737 to a stop at the gate with the precision of a pilot who had been flying commercially for years instead of weeks. The moment the engine spooled down, the aircraft door opened and paramedics rushed aboard with equipment that Dr. Chun had been wishing for during the entire flight. Male, approximately 55, massive cardiac arrest 43 minutes ago. Dr. Chun briefed the medical team rapidly. "I've maintained manual compressions throughout. No pulse, no spontaneous respiration." The paramedics took over with practiced efficiency, connecting Richardson to monitors and advanced life support equipment while preparing him for transport. Within minutes, they had him on a stretcher and were rushing toward a waiting ambulance. Rachel watched from the cockpit as the ambulance raced away from the airport, its sirens wailing and lights flashing. Everything possible had been done to give Captain Richardson a chance at survival. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. "Captain Martinez," a voice said from behind her. She turned to see a man in a Pacific Airways uniform with 4 stripes on his shoulders, another captain. "I'm Captain Williams, Chief Pilot's Officer." That was exceptional flying under impossible circumstances. Rachel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her as the adrenaline began to fade. The weight of what she had just accomplished was starting to sink in. She had successfully commanded a commercial airliner through a medical emergency, made critical decisions under extreme pressure, and landed safely with 156 passengers and crew aboard. "How did I do, really?" Rachel asked, suddenly feeling like the inexperienced pilot she actually was. Captain Williams smiled. "You did exactly what any of us would have done, maybe better. Your approach was textbook despite the time pressure. Your decision-making was sound throughout, and you kept your composure when everything was falling apart. That's what command is all about." First Officer Walsh was completing the post-flight shutdown checklist, but she looked up to add her own assessment. "I couldn't have handled this without you. When Captain Richardson collapsed, I was falling apart." Having another pilot in the cockpit made all the difference. Dr. Chun reappeared at the cockpit door, having accompanied Richardson as far as the ambulance. "I wanted to thank you both before I head to the hospital. Your quick action and excellent flying gave him the best possible chance. Whatever happens, you should know you did everything right." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes for the first time since the crisis began. The emotional weight of the past hour was finally hitting her. The fear, The responsibility, the pressure of making life or death decisions with limited experience. She had held it together when it mattered, but now the human cost of what had happened was becoming real. Flight attendant Maria Santos appeared with the passenger manifest and a grateful smile. All passengers have departed safely. Many of them asked me to thank the flight crew personally. They knew something serious was happening, but they felt safe because of how professionally everyone handled the situation. The passengers. Rachel realized she had been so focused on the emergency that she had barely thought about the 156 people in the cabin who had trusted her with their lives. They had experienced turbulence, heard medical emergency announcements, and felt the aircraft descending more rapidly than normal, but they had remained calm because the crew projected confidence and competence. What happens now? Rachel asked Captain Williams. Now you file your incident report, undergo the standard post-emergency evaluation, and probably answer a lot of questions from reporters who are already gathering outside. This story is going to make national news. A 26-year-old pilot with 3 weeks experience successfully commanding an emergency landing. The media will eat it up. Rachel groaned at the thought of media attention. She had become a pilot because she loved flying, not because she wanted fame or recognition. The idea of cameras and interviews felt almost as intimidating as the emergency itself had been. There's something else, Captain Williams continued. The chief pilot wants to see you in his office tomorrow morning. Don't worry, this isn't disciplinary. He wants to discuss your performance and talk about your career path. Pilots who handle emergencies this well at the beginning of their careers usually have very bright futures ahead of them. As Rachel finally left the cockpit of Flight 447, she reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of a single hour. This morning she had been an inexperienced first officer, hoping to prove herself worthy of a commercial flying career. Tonight she was being hailed as a hero who had saved 156 lives through quick thinking and exceptional flying skills. But the most important question remained unanswered. Would Captain David Richardson survive his cardiac arrest and return to the job he had performed with distinction for over 2 decades? Everything else, the media attention, the career implications, the recognition from fellow pilots, would mean nothing if the man who had collapsed in the captain's seat didn't make it through the night. The ambulance carrying Richardson disappeared into Seattle traffic, its sirens fading into the distance. Rachel Martinez stood on the jetway at SeaTac Airport, surrounded by emergency responders and airline officials. Knowing that her flying career had just taken a turn she never could have imagined when she woke up that morning in Denver. The Pacific Airways Operations Center at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport had transformed into something resembling a war room by 2:30 p.m. Chief Pilot Thomas Bradley stood before a wall of monitors displaying flight tracking data, weather information, and news feeds that were already picking up the story of Flight 447. In the span of 3 hours, what should have been a routine Tuesday had become one of the most scrutinized aviation events of the year. Rachel Martinez sat in a small conference room adjacent to the operations center, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The post-incident interview process was thorough but necessary. Federal Aviation Administration investigators needed to document every decision, every communication, and every procedure that had been followed or deviated from during the emergency. The questions came in methodical waves, designed to build a complete picture of what had happened at 38,000 feet. Walk me through your decision to assume command, FAA investigator Linda Chun asked, her recorder capturing every word. What specific factors influenced that choice? Rachel had answered variations of this question 4 times already, but she understood the importance of accuracy. Aviation safety depended on learning from every incident, especially those involving unusual circumstances like an inexperienced pilot taking emergency command. First Officer Walsh was clearly struggling with the stress of the situation, Rachel explained. She had the technical skills to fly the aircraft, but the psychological pressure was overwhelming her. I assessed that having a second qualified pilot in the cockpit, even one with limited experience, would improve our chances of a safe outcome. The investigator made notes and continued. Did you consider other alternatives? Could the flight have been safely continued with Walsh as sole pilot in command? Possibly, Rachel admitted. But Dr. Chun made it clear that time was critical for Captain Richardson's survival. Walsh was struggling with radio communications and approach planning simultaneously. Dividing those responsibilities between two pilots allowed us to reduce the approach time significantly. Outside the conference room, the story was taking on a life of its own. Social media had latched onto the narrative of a young female pilot heroically taking command during a medical emergency. News helicopters circled the airport, and reporters were interviewing passengers who praised the professionalism of the flight crew. The story had all the elements that media love: drama, heroism, and an underdog protagonist who had risen to meet an impossible challenge. But Rachel remained focused on the most important question: Captain David Richardson's condition. Every hour that passed without news from Harborview Medical Center increased her anxiety. She had done everything possible to get him to medical care quickly, but whether that would be enough remained unknown. Dr. Robert Chun appeared in the doorway of the conference room, still wearing the same clothes from the flight, but looking considerably more composed than he had during the medical emergency. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give you an update on Captain Richardson. Rachel looked up with a mixture of hope and dread. How is he? He's alive, Dr. Chun said, and Rachel felt her knees go weak with relief. The cardiac surgery team at Harborview was able to restore circulation about an hour ago. He's in critical but stable condition in the cardiac intensive care unit. The FAA investigator leaned forward with professional interest. What's the prognosis, doctor? Too early to say definitively, but the signs are encouraging. The CPR during flight maintained some circulation to his brain, which was crucial. The quick transport time from landing to advanced cardiac care made a significant difference. Without that emergency landing and rapid response, we would have lost him. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes again. All the decisions, all the pressure, all the risk had been worthwhile. Captain Richardson was alive, and he had a fighting chance at recovery. There's something else, Dr. Chun continued. Richardson regained consciousness briefly about 30 minutes ago. The first thing he asked about was whether his crew and passengers were safe. When the nurses told him everyone was fine, he specifically asked them to thank the pilot who took over for him. Chief Pilot Bradley entered the conference room, followed by a woman. Rachel didn't recognize someone in an expensive business suit who carried herself with the authority of senior management. Rachel, I'd like you to meet Sarah Johnson, Pacific Airways Vice President of Flight Operations, Bradley said. She flew up from Los Angeles specifically to meet with you. Johnson extended her hand with a warm smile. Captain Martinez, I've been reviewing the flight data and listening to air traffic control recordings. What you accomplished today was extraordinary by any measure. The title still felt strange. Captain Martinez. 3 weeks ago, she had been First Officer Martinez, and this morning she had been deadheading Passenger Martinez. The rapid progression felt surreal. I'd like to discuss your career path with Pacific Airways, Johnson continued. We have some opportunities that might interest you, given your demonstrated performance under pressure. Rachel was intrigued but cautious. What kind of opportunities? We're launching a new emergency response training program based partly on what happened today, Johnson explained. The industry has learned that having multiple qualified pilots available during emergencies can make critical differences in outcomes. We'd like you to help develop that program while continuing your regular flying duties. The offer was flattering, but Rachel found herself thinking about Captain Richardson lying in intensive care. Can I ask what this means for Captain Richardson's position? I don't want to benefit from his misfortune, Johnson's smile became more genuine. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes me confident in this offer. Richardson has 22 years with us and full medical benefits. His position will be waiting for him when he's cleared to return to duty. This opportunity is about expanding our capabilities, not replacing anyone. Bradley added his perspective. The aviation industry is going to study what happened on Flight 447 for years. The successful outcome, despite minimal experience in command, will influence training protocols, crew resource management procedures, and emergency response planning. You've already changed how we think about pilot development. The FAA investigator closed her notebook, apparently satisfied with the preliminary interview. Captain Martinez, I want you to know that your actions today represent exactly the kind of decision-making and airmanship that makes commercial aviation as safe as it is. You'll receive a commendation from the FAA once our investigation is complete. As the officials filed out of the conference room, Rachel found herself alone for the first time since the emergency began. The silence felt strange after hours of constant communication, interviews, and coordination. She pulled out her phone and realized she had 17 missed calls from her parents, 12 text messages from former flight school classmates, and 6 voicemails from reporters. The first call she returned was to her parents in Phoenix. Her father answered on the first ring. "Rachel, we saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad. Tired, but fine. The news is calling you a hero," her mother's voice added from the background. "They're saying you saved 156 lives." Rachel thought about that characterization. Had she saved lives, or had she simply done what any pilot would do in the same situation? The line between heroism and professional duty felt blurry. "I just did my job," she said. Maybe not the job I expected to do today, but the job that needed doing. Her father, with his mechanic's practical perspective, cut to the heart of the matter. Sometimes that's what heroism looks like, doing what needs to be done when everything goes wrong. First Officer Jennifer Walsh appeared in the doorway, looking considerably more relaxed than she had during the flight. "Mind if I join you?" "Please," Rachel said, gesturing to a chair. "How are you holding up?" "Better now that we know Richardson is stable," Walsh replied. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did up there. I've been flying for 8 months, and I thought I was ready for anything. Today taught me how much I still have to learn." "We all have things to learn," Rachel said. "I certainly learned more in 1 hour today than I did in 3 weeks of training." Walsh smiled. "The media wants to interview both of us. They're particularly interested in the female pilot's saving the day angle. Are you planning to talk to them?" Rachel had been dreading the media attention, but she was beginning to see it differently. If her story could inspire other young women to pursue aviation careers, or if it could help people understand the professionalism and skill that commercial pilots brought to their jobs every day, maybe the attention could serve a positive purpose. "I think I will," Rachel decided. "But I want to make sure the focus stays on the team effort, you, Dr. Chun, the flight attendants, air traffic control. Nobody gets through something like this alone." 3 days later, Rachel stood in Captain Richardson's hospital room at Harborview Medical Center. He was awake and alert, though still connected to various monitoring devices. The doctors had upgraded his condition to stable, and his prognosis had improved significantly. "Captain Martinez," Richardson said, his voice still weak but steady. "I understand I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," Rachel replied. "I just did what you would have done if our positions were reversed." Richardson smiled. "Maybe, but I've been flying for 22 years, and I've never had to take command of someone else's aircraft during an emergency. What you did required more than just technical skill. It required judgment and courage that can't be taught." He paused, looking serious. "I want you to know that I'm recommending you for accelerated advancement to senior captain. You've already proven you can handle the responsibility." Rachel was touched by the offer, but found herself thinking about the bigger picture. Actually, I've been offered a position developing emergency training programs. I think that might be where I can do the most good helping other pilots prepare for situations like what we faced. Richardson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right answer. Good pilots never stop learning, and great pilots help others learn too. 6 months later, Rachel Martinez stood before a classroom of pilot trainees at Pacific Airways Training Center, using Flight 447 as a case study in crisis management and crew resource utilization. The emergency that had thrust her into command had evolved into a new career path focused on preparing the next generation of pilots for the unexpected challenges they might face. Captain David Richardson had returned to active duty 3 months earlier, flying the same routes he had commanded for over 2 decades. He kept a photo from Rachel's commendation ceremony in his flight bag, a reminder that aviation safety depended on pilots supporting each other, regardless of experience level. The lessons learned from Flight 447 had spread throughout the aviation industry. Airlines revised their emergency procedures to better utilize all qualified pilots aboard aircraft during crises. Training programs incorporated scenarios involving command transitions and medical emergencies. The successful outcome had demonstrated that in aviation, experience was valuable, but decisive action and sound judgment were irreplaceable. Rachel still flew regularly, now as a senior captain on international routes. But her true passion had become education and emergency preparedness. She had discovered that teaching other pilots gave her the same satisfaction as flying, the knowledge that her efforts contributed to the safety and professionalism that made commercial aviation possible. Flight 447 had lasted less than 2 hours from takeoff to landing, but its impact had reshaped careers, influenced industry practices, and demonstrated that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are sitting in row 2, ready to answer the call when everything goes wrong at 38,000 feet. 5 years after Pacific Airways Flight 447, Rachel Martinez walked through the corridors of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. She paused in front of a new exhibit featuring artifacts from her emergency flight, the flight manual she had referenced in the cockpit, Captain Richardson's recovered logbook, and a detailed recreation of the 737's instrument panel, showing the exact conditions during their emergency descent. The placard read, "Crisis at 38,000 feet. How crew resource management saved 156 lives." Visitors gathered around the display, reading about decision-making under pressure and the importance of utilizing all available resources during aviation emergencies. School children pressed their faces against the glass, fascinated by the story of a young pilot who had stepped up when everything went wrong. Rachel smiled at the irony. She had never wanted fame or recognition, just the opportunity to fly. Yet her brief moment of crisis management had evolved into something much larger than she ever imagined. The Flight 447 protocols developed from her experience were now standard training at aviation academies worldwide. Her emergency response manual had become required reading for commercial pilot certification. Dr. Robert Chun approached from behind, now sporting gray hair but the same calm demeanor that had served him so well during Richardson's cardiac arrest. He had become the chief medical advisor for Pacific Airways' new medical emergency protocols, helping design procedures for handling in-flight health crises. Still strange seeing yourself in a museum? Dr. Chun asked with a grin. Surreal, Rachel admitted. Sometimes I feel like they're talking about someone else entirely. I was just doing what needed to be done. That's exactly why it worked, Dr. Chun replied. No ego, no hesitation, just competent decision-making when seconds mattered. They walked together toward the museum's conference room, where Rachel was scheduled to speak at the annual Aviation Safety Symposium. The audience would include airline executives, safety investigators, and pilot trainers from around the world, all gathering to discuss lessons learned from Flight 447 and similar incidents. As they entered the conference room, Rachel spotted a familiar figure in the front row. Captain David Richardson, now Pacific Airways Director of Safety, had flown in specifically for her presentation. At 62, he showed no lingering effects from his cardiac arrest, though he admitted to eating better and exercising more since his brush with mortality. Richardson stood to greet her with genuine warmth. "Ready to inspire another generation of pilots?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "Though I still think you should be the one giving this presentation. You're the one with decades of wisdom to share." Richardson shook his head. "Experience is valuable, but you prove that instinct and judgment matter more than hours in a logbook. That's a lesson worth repeating." The symposium moderator called for attention, and Rachel took her place at the podium. The audience of 300 aviation professionals represented thousands of years of combined flying experience, yet they had gathered to hear from someone whose defining moment had lasted less than 2 hours. 5 years ago, I was deadheading home as a passenger when Captain Richardson's medical emergency changed everything," Rachel began. "What I learned that day wasn't about flying techniques or emergency procedures. It was about leadership, teamwork, and the importance of staying calm when others are counting on you." She clicked to her first slide, showing Flight 447's route from Denver to Seattle. "The aviation industry teaches us that safety is built on redundancy, training, and following procedures. But sometimes safety depends on recognizing when normal procedures aren't sufficient and having the courage to adapt." Rachel walked through the timeline of events, explaining the decision points and highlighting how each crew member had contributed to the successful outcome. She emphasized First Officer Walsh's quick thinking under pressure, Dr. Chun's life-saving medical intervention, and the professionalism of Flight Attendant Maria Santos in managing passenger concerns. The media focused on the young pilot taking command, Rachel continued. But the real story is about crew resource management working exactly as designed. We had a medical professional aboard who knew how to sustain life, an experienced first officer who knew the aircraft systems, and a qualified pilot available to assist with command decisions. The system worked because everyone understood their role and executed it professionally. An airline executive in the third row raised his hand. "Captain Martinez, how has this experience influenced your approach to training new pilots?" "It taught me that technical skills are only part of pilot development," Rachel replied. "We need to prepare pilots for psychological pressure, decision-making with incomplete information, and leadership responsibilities they might face unexpectedly. Emergency scenarios and simulators are valuable, but they can't replicate the emotional weight of knowing that real lives depend on your choices." A flight instructor from Japan asked about international applications of the Flight 447 protocols. Rachel explained how the emergency procedures had been adapted for different aircraft types and regulatory environments, emphasizing the universal principles of clear communication, role definition, and resource utilization. After the formal presentation, smaller groups gathered for detailed discussions about specific aspects of the incident. Rachel found herself surrounded by young pilots asking about career development and handling pressure situations. She answered each question thoughtfully, remembering her own uncertainty at their age. Jennifer Walsh, now a captain herself, joined the conversation. She had become one of Pacific Airways' most requested instructor pilots, using her experience from Flight 447 to teach crisis management and crew coordination. "The thing people don't understand," Walsh told the group of young pilots, "is that Rachel didn't just take over and start giving orders. She assessed the situation, identified what each person could contribute, and created a team that was stronger than any individual pilot could have been alone." As the symposium concluded, Rachel walked outside onto the National Mall. The Washington Monument rose into the evening sky, surrounded by the buildings where aviation policy was developed and safety regulations were written. Her story had contributed to changes in how the industry thought about emergency response, but she knew the real impact was measured in incidents that never happened. Emergencies that were handled more effectively because of lessons learned from Flight 447. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, now Pacific Airways Director of Cabin Safety, watching the symposium livestream. Still proud to have been part of that crew. Richardson's cardiac protocols you developed just saved another life on Flight 892 yesterday. Rachel smiled at the message. This was the real legacy of Flight 447, not the museum exhibits or media attention, but the quiet improvements in safety procedures that protected passengers every day. Captain Richardson's cardiac emergency had become a case study that prepared other flight crews for similar situations. The next morning, Rachel visited Arlington National Cemetery before her flight back to Seattle. She stopped at the Memorial for Aviation Pioneers, reading names of pilots who had advanced the science of flight through their courage and innovation. Many had faced their defining moments in wartime or during test flights that pushed the boundaries of what aircraft could accomplish. Her defining moment had been different, a routine flight that became extraordinary through circumstances beyond anyone's control. Yet the principles were the same: technical competence, sound judgment, and the courage to act when action was required. Rachel's phone rang as she walked back toward the taxi. The caller ID showed Pacific Airways operations. Captain Martinez, we have a situation developing on Flight 1247, the dispatcher said. Medical emergency, and the captain is requesting consultation with someone experienced in cardiac incidents during flight. Rachel checked her watch. She could catch a flight to Denver and potentially assist with another emergency, sharing the hard-won knowledge from her experience 5 years earlier. It wouldn't be the same as being in the cockpit, but remote consultation had become another tool in the aviation safety toolkit. Patch me through to the aircraft, Rachel said. Let's see how we can help. As she climbed into the taxi heading toward Reagan National Airport, Rachel reflected on how Flight 447 had shaped not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. Flying wasn't just about technical skills or following procedures. It was about accepting responsibility for other people's lives and being prepared to rise to challenges that couldn't be anticipated or simulated. The taxi pulled away from Arlington Cemetery, carrying her toward another aircraft. Another crew facing the unexpected. 5 years after her 47 minutes of crisis management over the Colorado Rockies, Rachel Martinez was still answering the call when aviation professionals needed the wisdom that could only come from living through the impossible and finding a way to make it work. Flight 447 had ended 5 years ago, but its legacy continued with every emergency procedure that worked more effectively, every pilot who handled pressure with greater composure, and every passenger who landed safely because someone had learned from Captain Richardson's cardiac arrest and Rachel's unlikely promotion from row 2 to the captain's seat. The story of Flight 447 wasn't really about one emergency flight. It was about how the aviation industry learned, adapted, and became safer through the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the situation demanded nothing less than their very best. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.